riots, gangs, and the culture of survival. By the late 1970s, Rikers Island had become a boiling pot of rage. Overcrowding, neglect, and the rise of street gangs inside the city were mirrored within its walls. When tensions reached a breaking point, riots erupted, explosions of chaos that would make national headlines. One of the first major riots came in 1975, when hundreds of inmates took control of a cell block. They smashed windows, set fires, and battled correctional officers in hallways. It took tactical police units hours to regain control. The message was clear. The city had lost its grip on Rikers. As the crack epidemic gripped New York in the 1980s, Rikers became the battleground for gangs like the Bloods, Latin Kings, and Nietas. Street rivalries spilled directly into the jails, where alliances determined survival. Weapons were everywhere, shanks carved from toothbrushes, razors melted into comb handles, even pieces of metal stripped from broken fixtures. Every inmate knew the rule: arm yourself or become a victim. Fights could break out in an instant. A dirty look, a debt unpaid, or a word said too loud. Within seconds, the corridors turned into war zones. And often, the guards didn't intervene, not right away. Correction officers, outnumbered and undertrained, relied on overwhelming force to retake control. But their tactics often fueled the cycle of violence. Beatings, lockdowns, and collective punishment hardened the inmates further, convincing them that survival meant fighting back harder. By the 1990s, federal investigators reported that gangs effectively governed entire units. Guards allowed it, sometimes willingly. Keeping order meant cutting deals, letting gang leaders control discipline inside in exchange for a fragile peace. It became known as the program. The program was never written in official policy, but everyone inside Rikers knew it. Gang leaders enforced their own rules. Step out of line, and you'd be beaten or worse. Inmates lived under two governments, the Department of Correction on paper and the gangs in practice. An underground economy flourished. Cigarettes, drugs, food, and favors became currency. For many, joining a gang wasn't a choice, it was survival. The gangs of Rikers didn't just control the inside. Their influence reached back into New York's neighborhoods. Orders flowed from the blocks to the streets, fueling violence outside the walls. For families, Rikers was a nightmare. Many sent loved ones to await trial, only to never see them return alive. Deaths from violence, neglect, or suicide piled up, year after year. By the end of the 1990s, Rikers had become a city unto itself. Over 20,000 people packed into its decaying buildings. For some, it was a waiting room for trial. For others, a death sentence without conviction. But the worst was still to come. By the early 2000s, Rikers Island was no longer a hidden secret. The outside world was beginning to learn the truth, thanks to lawsuits, whistleblowers, and investigative reporters. Stories of abuse, neglect, and deaths behind bars spilled into the headlines, exposing the island's darkest corners. Correction officers themselves began to speak out. Some described an environment where brutality was encouraged, not punished. Others admitted that gangs had more control than the Department of Correction. The line between guard and inmate was blurred, both trapped in the same cycle of violence. In 2014, the U.S. Department of Justice issued a scathing report, calling conditions at Rikers unconstitutional. Investigators described routine beatings of inmates, deliberate indifference to medical needs, and a culture of impunity among staff. For the first time, the federal government openly declared what inmates had long known. Rikers was broken beyond repair. The death of Khalif Browder brought global attention. His story wasn't an anomaly. It was a symbol. For years, thousands like him had languished inside, unconvicted, forgotten. Browder's suicide after his release shook the nation and forced leaders to confront what Rikers had become. Public outrage turned into a movement. Activists, families, and civil rights leaders marched in the streets, demanding Rikers be shut down. The slogan was simple but powerful: Close Rikers, City officials launched investigations, committees, and reform plans. Reports recommended billions of dollars in upgrades or closure. For the first time, serious talk of shutting down Rikers became mainstream. Inside, however, nothing changed fast enough. Deaths continued. Reports of suicides, overdoses, and medical neglect piled up. Federal monitors said the jail was out of control, describing conditions more like a war zone than a correctional FA. In 2015, dozens of correction officers were indicted in corruption and brutality cases. Some were accused of beating inmates nearly to death. Others were caught smuggling drugs, cigarettes, and cell phones. The system was rotten to its core. For families, every new scandal was another wound. Mothers buried sons who never should have died. Wives and children were left without fathers. Rikers wasn't just a jail. It was destroying entire communities. In 2017, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio announced a historic decision. Rikers Island would be shut down. In its place, smaller borough-based jails would rise. The city promised that by 2027, the Island of Shadows would be no more. But closing Rikers proved easier said than done. Political battles, construction delays, and rising crime rates all pushed the timeline back. As of today, thousands still remain inside its walls. The fight is not over. The unfinished end. Today, Rikers remains crumbling, chaotic, and controversial. The promise to close it has become one of New York's most debated issues. Some say it's a necessary step toward justice. Others fear smaller jails will only spread the same problems across the city. Inside, thousands still wait. Some guilty, others not yet convicted. For many, Rikers is not just a place to await trial. It is a sentence before a sentence. In recent years, deaths inside have reached numbers not seen in decades. Suicide, overdose, medical neglect, the headlines keep coming. Federal monitors say conditions are worse than ever, but the fight has not stopped. Activists, families, and even correctional officers demand change. For them, Rikers is more than a jail, it is the symbol of everything broken in America's justice system. From its beginnings in the 1930s to today, Rikers has carried the same curse, built to solve a problem, but instead becoming one. Whether Rikers closes tomorrow, in 2027, or never at all, the island has left a permanent scar on New York. For every story of survival, there is a story of loss. For every cell that opens, another memory of suffering remains. This is the untold truth about Rikers Island.